this is, to me, it's a free win. To none of the gear that I spoke about. I'm thinking specifically of, let's say, the 500 US Marine late model Abrams that went into storage, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. Transfer them straight to, or give an order that the plans should be executed and implemented for those to go to Ukraine. Take 2 years to get them probably fixed up and ready, but that's fine. Give the order now. A long-term program. Is it cost-free? No. But is it expensive? No. Will those tanks ever fight China? No, they won't. You could apply the same across ground capabilities, all of which the US have in storage, none of which will be used in the event of a war in the West Pacific, which of course is a looming threat, which really the US armed forces are more concerned about than anything the Russians can offer.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine with Frank Ledwidge. Frank is a former military intelligence officer who served in the Balkans, Kosovo, Iraq and Afghanistan. He's now a senior fellow at the University of Portsmouth and a barrister. Frank, thank you so much for your time. Welcome to Frontline.
Thanks, James. Great to be with you.
First of all, we better start with events in the Black Sea, where Russia has confirmed one of its warships has been damaged by Ukraine. How significant a victory is this for the Ukrainians?
Well, it's another tactical success for the Ukrainian Navy and intelligence services who will have set this up. It's a testament as well, I think, to the effectiveness of our missiles that we sent them. This is probably a British Storm Shadow or maybe a French Scalp, but essentially they're the same thing. I think that from the reports I've read, and we can only go on that, there were 2 of these cruise missiles that were either spoofed the S-400, which are very capable Russian defences, and got stuck into the dock where the Novichokazk, which is the name of the ship, was moored, and one or both of them hit this ship, and it's very clear that it's been very severely damaged. And that's all great, and it's part of a pattern, or a very successful pattern of Ukraine's navy, which does not consist of any major surface vessels, notwithstanding the soon-to-be deployed British-made minesweepers that hopefully will get there at some point. But it has no surface assets, manned surface assets. So the Ukrainian Navy essentially holds control over the Western Black Sea now. And this is just another testament to that. Also, it demonstrates the stretched nature of Russian air defences across the whole front. You would think that they would focus on Crimea, but there have been several major attacks on particularly on Russian naval assets on the coast there, the western coast of Crimea, notably the attack on their headquarters, I think that was October, November, which again was a complex drone stroke cruise missile attack, again, majoring on the Storm Shadow. So that's great. So tactically a great success, witnessing probably Ukraine's major success this year, which is their regaining or gaining at least of some element of control in the Western Black Sea. Operationally, at that next level, it's not really very significant. This is the second or maybe third, depending on who you believe, of the same class of ships that's been sunk or destroyed. The other one was called the Minsk earlier this year in October, but far more significant was the destruction of a submarine, the Rostov, which the Russians say will be repaired. Again, though, these ships, not the submarine, are old. They're all 80s vintage, about the same vintage as our oldest frigates. They're soon to be decommissioned. They're useful, but really more as glorified armed ferries than anything else. And indeed, the Ukrainians say that the Novichokazk was transporting drones around, which sounds credible to me. It's the sort of thing that you would expect them to have intelligence on that. And but other than that, really, it's just it's continuing the erosion or the attrition of the Black Sea Fleet, which doesn't have that much impact right now, its surface fleet, on what's going on anymore. So it's great to have happened, but that's about it.
Does that explain why Russia isn't prioritising more of its air defences around Crimea? Because, I mean, you mentioned, Frank, that their air defences are quite stretched at the moment. Symbolically, it may be really significant that they've lost this warship. And, of course, it follows on from the sinking of the Moskva last year, which was symbolically really powerful. But is it just not worth their while prioritising their air defences on Crimea as things stand?
I don't know, James. It would seem to me that this should be a priority. It's not only their naval assets in Sevastopol that presents, or rather represents, value to the Russians. There's plenty of other major assets, several air bases, and perhaps most importantly, there's a radar station. It may well be that the Ukrainians are steering clear of this. It's a ballistic missile defense station there, which is extremely important. It's very similar to it's a very similar station at Fylingdales, and that would be a very difficult target to attack presentationally and strategically, and it might not please the Americans to do so. So there are major targets in that area, other than the naval base. And I know the naval base is both symbolically, as you indicate, and actually operationally really important. And it's the only, as has been said many times on this program and others, it's the only outlet that the Russians have to for their fleet that isn't guaranteed to be bunged up by ice in the winter. So no, I think it does demonstrate to some extent the porousness of Russian air defences, which are, let's to be candid, really effective objectively, as indeed are the Ukrainians. By the same token, they're both porous, but and they can both impose what's called mutual air denial on the adversaries, which is why the Ukrainian Air Force, with rare exceptions such as those last couple of days when they shot down some. So which is why really neither side can get any purchase over the zero line, because of this mutual effectiveness of their air defences. But look, they're porous, and it's very clear that specific directed attacks, and the Ukrainians are very good at that, with spoofing drones, with perhaps knocking out radars temporarily. Who knows how they did it? But in these complex attacks, they can strike Russian targets within range. It's much more difficult to hit Moscow, Belgorod, Rostov, which are behind far more layers. But yeah, one would think that this would be a priority. I don't think they've deprioritised it. It just shows that the relative vulnerability. But that cuts two ways,
As you mentioned, Frank, it's believed this warship was carrying Iranian-supplied Shahed drones. How difficult do you think Russia is finding it in terms of transporting cargo at the moment, particularly given the damage sustained to the Kerch Bridge?
I don't know. I think it's very significant broadly from a naval perspective. That's my background 100 years ago in the Navy. What this represents overall is the vulnerability of surface assets, of ships, to shore-based anti-ship missiles, such as or in this context, the Storm Shadow, which isn't an anti-ship missile, but more specifically the Neptunes, which are likely to have been the missiles that sank the Moskva. You're very unwise now to go near a defended coastline, which by the way, gives a message to our own Navy, as to the future of major surface assets near defended shorelines, and then ask questions of our own naval strategy as well as Russians. But back to your point, I don't know is the answer. Clearly, they're finding ways to get the Shahids and other missiles to Crimea and the other launch sites. I don't think they need to get them to Crimea unless they're striking the south. Clearly, the Belarus and Western Russia are still available for that kind of thing. So I don't know. It's not something I've tracked very closely. But overall, there's a very significant message to Western navies about the way the Ukrainians have not just guarded their coastline, but denied a pretty large tract of seaway to Russian surface assets. Now, we don't know what the subsurface assets are up to, but I suspect they're up to a lot. And of course, they are used just as destroyers or rather more corvettes down there, Russian corvettes. Submarines are used to launch a lot of the Kalibra attacks into Ukraine. And we've not seen any anti-submarine capability deployed by the Ukrainians. I don't think we will. But anyway, that's more broadly. I don't know the answer to your direct question.
And given, as you mentioned, Frank, Ukraine's navy isn't really a conventional navy. How will Putin be finding the attacks on the Black Sea fleet? I mean, Ukraine have been remarkably effective at limiting its operational capability from the Moskva to now this. I mean, that must be humiliating for Putin.
Yes, but so are the major losses they're sustaining on the ground. But the question he will ask is not, well, do we have this ship or that? It's how is the campaign proceeding? Losses are, it seems to me, are not irrelevant, but of secondary concern. Grant Shapps pointed out just the last couple of days that the Black Sea's lost 20% of its capability just over the last 2 or 3 months. So that's probably right, especially with the submarine that got struck. But my view of the way that the Russian leadership looks at losses, whether it's Gerasimov or Putin at that level, is look, are we proceeding? Are we succeeding in our strategic objectives or not? Losses are secondary, and that's a traditional Russian approach. Of course, it's slightly different from ours.
And is this attack going to affect Russia's ability in the immediate short term to transfer troops into eastern Ukraine?
No, I think they can do that through Crimea across the bridge. Don't forget that the bridge is also supplemented by ferries, and the bridge now is very heavily guarded by short-range, both short-range missile systems, and they don't want another embarrassment. Doesn't mean they're not going to get one. I think the GUR and the other Ukrainian special units are pretty focused on the Kerch Bridge, but no, there are ferry service. I don't think they're having a problem with that. When this landing ship, it's very old, it's obsolete, it's probably built in 1987. They're replacing that class, and they certainly won't be deploying any more landing ships down there. In its function as a landing ship, it's probably never going to be used in the foreseeable future. But it was used as a truck, as you indicate. And no, it's very difficult for the Russians to do that little hooking route down to the south of Crimea, and they're always at risk, and they always will be. Don't forget, though, that the interesting thing about this again is that it was attacked in port. We've not seen any other attacks at sea now for several months, I think. Generally speaking, the Ukrainians very wisely attack these things in port, which is the safest and best way to do it. Why wouldn't you attack them when they're static and potentially defended by porous missile systems, and attacking them at sea where they can move around and are probably less vulnerable? But that's really I'm pushing the bounds here of my knowledge and trying to reflect back to old experiences decades ago.
And just finally on this, Frank, do you expect the Ukrainians to continue their tactic of targeting the Black Sea Fleet?
Yeah, for sure. Every blow on it is an embarrassment to Russia's military and to a lesser extent political leadership. It's symbolic. It causes them informational damage. Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't you? And continue the attrition. I mean, I think the Black Sea Fleet was rendered essentially irrelevant when they basically effectively withdrew from Sevastopol. When was it? 2 or 3 months ago. I mean, that was a major victory for the Ukrainians. And sneaking in and out with this landing ship or that landing craft is neither here nor there. They can't deploy their major combat assets on the surface. Under the surface, they can.
Away from the Black Sea, Russia in recent days claims to have captured the town of Marinka in eastern Ukraine. Commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, General Zaluzhny, says they've moved to the outskirts of the town. If indeed, as it is suggested, Russia has captured it, just what is, in your view, the significance of that, Frank?
Well, it's part of an overall. I was talking to someone who's down there about 3 weeks ago, and I hadn't realised really the significance of Avdiivka and Marinka and that area around there. For significance, there's a propaganda value to it, and of course tactical value. Propaganda value is that if they can push the Ukrainians back out of those salients in Marinka and Avdiivka, then the Ukrainians will be out of artillery range of Donetsk. And it's been a running embarrassment for the last 8 years that Donetsk and the Russian-backed units down there have been subject to Ukrainian artillery fire now since 2014. Massive embarrassment. So that's the first purpose for Marinka and slightly to the north Avdiivka being focused on now. As for, Ukrainians say they still hold a little bit of the village. It was about 10,000 people, I think. It's not a village. Yeah, it's kind of a large village, isn't it? Neither here nor there. It's a tactical success. Push back the Ukrainians another couple of kilometres. There are several river systems down there, and you would expect the Russians to proceed if they were capable of following on, which they're not, to the next targets pretty quickly. They won't do that, I think. The same, unfortunately, is likely to be true. Sorry, unfortunately for the Russians. By unfortunately, I mean when and if Avdiivka is captured. But the primary objective, as I understand it, is to push the Ukrainians out of artillery range of that major city of Donetsk, which is the jewel in the crown, if you can call it. It's a pretty miserable one, but jewel in the crown of the Donbass campaign from 2014. Remember, not recently.
It's interesting, the capture of Marinka, because as you kind of imply, Frank, so much of the conversation has been around Avdiivka in recent months. Some of the focus hasn't really been on Marinka. Do you see them as of equivalent significance or different?
No, I think Avdiivka is more important. It's a bit bigger, but they're all part of the same operation, let's say. And that operation will continue until the Russians capture Avdiivka. The question is, will the Ukrainians commit to the same extent they did in Bakhmut, which was a bit bigger this time last year? And I hope they don't, but there we are.
But I mean, Bakhmut took on a huge symbolic significance, but a lot of analysts would say actually strategically it wasn't that important, whereas Marinka and Avdiivka, because of their proximity to Donetsk, are more significant strategically.
Yeah, that seems to me right. But then, in an attritional war, so now we've moved into a positional phase of an attritional war. And what counts now is losses. And frankly, Ukraine is now on the defensive, and therefore it needs to think in terms of balancing loss and gain. It can't, in my view, it should never have done it anyway, but committing tens of thousands of casualties to a town like Bakhmut, which, as you say, is of questionable strategic value. Now, I've had arguments put to me by Ukrainians to the effect that no, it was actually very important, out with its propaganda value. Not just as a fortress city, but as in terms of its location. I can't see that myself, but hey, lots of people died there, and I know a couple who did. Whether they should have done is another matter, and that's a decision for the Ukrainians. But the question was concerning Avdiivka. It's the last place from which the Ukrainians can shell Donetsk, and that's of symbolic value. Whether that's worth the lives of thousands of defenders who can better be used elsewhere is a question for Ukrainian High Command, and I wouldn't wish to go there beyond what I've said.
Although at the moment, with losses around Avdiivka, it seems like the Russian casualty rate is the main issue. I mean, they are losing a huge number of men every day.
Yeah, so are the Ukrainians, but probably given that they're in the assault and that those assaults apparently tend not to be very competently carried out. Can the Ukrainians afford those losses? I mean, we can get on to the loss situation, the sort of relative loss situation, if you like. There's also the presentational problem and the political problem of conceding land at this stage, which the Ukrainians are doing every day, 100 metres by 100 metres. But that's not significant. What's significant, in my view, is the casualties they're taking and the ability to replace those casualties, and of course, how they're going to proceed on the defensive for the next phase of the war. I think they will defend Avdiivka as they did Bakhmut. But if you look at the map and you look at the way that the Russian assaults are creeping, are rendering that kettle, as the Germans call it, all the more tight, salient, as we might call it, tighter and tighter. This is getting looking a lot more like Bakhmut than one would like. And we hopefully wouldn't get to a situation where the Ukrainians have to fight their way out of that. I don't think they will, but that was a situation they were faced with at one point in Bakhmut.
And do you see, Frank, as an if or a when Avdiivka falls?
A when. But it won't be quickly. Yeah, it's not going to be soon. It's the same. If the Russians want it and want to commit those troops to it, they don't care too much about losses. They can replace those losses, which is the point. They'll take that, yeah. I mean, you can just need to look at the map and see why. And then you have to ask, well, is it worth holding on to?
Let's come on to what Ukraine's objectives will be from a military perspective as we move into 2024. A lot of people saying at the moment their priority is just to consolidate their defensive positions before a likely counteroffensive in the spring. And of course, a lot of that depends on the military aid they receive from the West. We'll come on to that in a minute. Assuming they have the military support that they've been receiving thus far, what will be their strategic objectives in the spring?
To concede as little land as possible. Let's look at two indicators. So on the 24th of November this year, one of the more capable Ukrainian ministers and the Minister for Infrastructure, I can't remember either of their names, unfortunately, my apologies, easily found, were given the task of construction of defensive fortifications. And there's something of a controversy in Ukraine right now as to why this wasn't considered before. And we know why. The politically, it's very difficult for Zelensky's team to concede that they may have to defend instead of continuing to be on the assault. But that task force, which we might call it, was formed in late November, and I think is considered a priority. The purpose, as I say, is to create defensive lines a bit like the Russians did. Now, some people think it's a bit late to do that, but like I said, it was politically difficult to do it before. So that's the first. The second thing is, as you know, last week, a presidential order went out to begin preparations for a mobilization. So putting these together and having in regard to what I said before about relative casualties, what we can see is that Ukraine is not in any position at the moment to conduct defensive operations and will have to focus on defensive operations. And again, when you play into that, not so much European, but the vital US decision, which I'm sure you and I would agree, and all our viewers would agree, eventually that's going to get through. They're going to get their money. Somebody will concede about the US border, which is another issue. But even if they do, I think it's going to be very tricky for Ukraine this year. And they realise that. And much of it depends not just on US aid, but on how they'll play this defensive issue.
Do you think that means when we talk about a potential counteroffensive, people talk about the spring? Do you think it may be later than the spring, if indeed it comes at all?
I don't think there'll be a counteroffensive, as we would call it, like there was last year, this year. Look, we all made, to a greater or lesser degree, the mistake of believing our own propaganda last year. Now, some people, many of these generals whose record of truth-telling and strategic prediction we can divine from what happened in Afghanistan, which they were all involved in, were talking about sweeps through to the Azov Sea and Crimea by Christmas and such nonsense. Other people, more conservative, would say that Ukrainians may have got to Tokmak, but they wouldn't have got any further, and that this was going to be, in the words of General Richard Sharef, a friend of mine, a series of operations taking years. And I think that's more likely to be the case. I don't think the next in those series of operations is going to be this year. This year, as you said, is more likely to be not just as you said, consolidation, but I think it'll be a bit touch and go for the Ukrainians this year, really, to be candid with you. The Russians aren't concerned about losses. The Ukrainians are. Volunteers are very few, which is why a mobilization order has been issued. It hasn't been executed or implemented yet. The Ukrainians will have to focus on defending what they have, I think, this year, and imposing whatever attrition, which will be considerable, they can on Russian forces. That's got to be the focus this year. Also, the war is slightly changing tactically, as you will know. There's been such a huge focus, and rightly so, on artillery up to now, but it's worth remembering that Ukrainian hospitals are admitting now 50% artillery casualties and 50% FPV drone casualties. Those level of casualties is very high. We're looking at, according to fairly credible reports from the US, between 200 and 300 amputee casualties per day. Half of which, as I say, are imposed by FPV drones, which currently the Russians have the edge. Now, I think that may shift this year, but that's the crucial measure now, along with artillery, which you've discussed many times before. And unless some kind of technical whiz kids can invent some way of countering these things, which they may, then that's going to be it's going to be the major new factor this year. For the whole battle, that and artillery, and on neither front is Ukraine in the driving seat.
Let's work on the assumption, Frank, that Congress does approve the extra military aid for Ukraine and it gets applied in the next few months. What specifically does Ukraine need right now? A lot of people I speak to on the front line say actually they just need basic ammunition, they need shells more than anything, and yet there's also the hope for increased air power as well. What do you think is crucial for them?
I think a long-term strategy would be good. We've heard variations on the as long as it takes, whatever it is. I've argued for a long time that we need to define what it is. At no point, James, it's worth remembering this, have the US, in the hundreds or dozens of declarations from Blinken, Biden, Austin, or any of the others, stated that the objective is to retake all of Ukraine's land. Now, they may say they'd like to do so, but we'd all like human rights throughout the world as well. That's not a declaration. It's a declaration of design, not a declaration of strategy or policy. The nearest we've had to a strategy, come to your point, I'm very conscious of it. The nearest we've had to a strategy so far is Lloyd Austin's announcement in April 2022 that we're going to, this is a purpose here is to bleed Russia so they can't do to another country, i.e. NATO, what it's doing to Ukraine. It's bad news for the Ukrainians and always has been. The problem is with American strategies, like usual, it backfires. And what we're having now, of course, is what we will have and are seeing now is a much stronger, notwithstanding the Black Sea debacle they've suffered, a much stronger Russian military and industrial complex, including the military, than we have seen before. I'm talking about strategy. So Russia has essentially re-engineered its economic and industrial base to the military. Now, we are re-engineering certain aspects of that base, and by we I mean the Europeans, us, the Americans, to certain aspects, artillery shells notably, which we're failing in. We have to ask, is Ukraine a priority? Did we see as one of Rishi Sunak's 5 priorities, for example, this year? Ukraine, we did not. Saw boats and waiting lists and even announcements on smoking and such like. At no point has Ukraine been a priority for us. Is it a priority for the US? Well, is it? We'll see. But let's assume, as you say, that they get that money. This is going to be a long war. It's going to go into 2025, 26, 27 probably. Even after that, Ukraine will need to defend itself. And what we're seeing are gifts of money to the Ukrainians and drip feed of weapons and temporizing and political support depending on the latest victory. And what we need is long-term commitment. So, to come back to your point, air power. That's the most encouraging aspect of this, the whole piece. We've seen the F-16s, probably not the right aircraft for Ukraine, but it's the best we can give them for now. The significance of that is that we are hooking into Europe and the US, the Ukrainian air power. F-16s themselves are of limited tactical significance at the moment. They maybe by 26, 27, they will form part of a system of air power that Ukrainians can really use to challenge Russian air power. So that's great. That's a long-term project, and it's avowedly so. We saw Dutch announcements recently to that effect. They're committing a great deal of resources to that. We'll need to see this, and we're going to see the Swedes do that eventually. But all these are long-term commitments, and that's great. That's all positive. Gripens, maybe F-18s. That's the kind of air force that Ukraine needs. A balanced air power. Sorry, rephrase. Balanced air power, however, requires more than fighters and bombers. It requires ISTAR assets, intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition. It requires, especially for the Ukrainians, a suppression of air defences, suppression of enemy air defence, and destruction of enemy air defence capability, which even the Royal Air Force don't have. Okay, the US do, the Royal Air Force don't. Now, they can build that. It's going to take years to build, but we're seeing the start of that. And that's the kind of pattern one would like to see also for ground forces. So let me give you an example. The US having drip-fed ammunition on a monthly basis, and forgive me for being blunt about this, that's the way it has been, may want to consider re-equipping the Ukrainian army in its entirety. And they can do that with this should have been done, this kind of decision should be made 18 months ago, but better late than never, and better now than any other time in the future, by re-equipping the Ukrainian army in its entirety. How can they do that? At minimal cost, with the reserve stocks, which consist of thousands, count them, thousands, James, of tanks, armoured vehicles, SUVs, which are really important down there in the front line. I've not been to the front line yet, but I believe that kind of connectivity, the sort of lower end stuff you hinted at before, thousands of those, armoured personnel carriers, armoured fighting vehicles, mobile artillery, alongside the commitment of Europe and the US to future artillery supplies. FPV programs. Now, that's where the UK are working really well. I think what we'll see is more of an involvement of UK assets into trying to match the first-person view, the FPV drones, which are taking so many casualties now out of the Ukrainians. programs are in development. That's great to see. It's got to be long term. So rather than this sort of temporizing, well, we'll see how it goes, or let's just keep this going as long as we can to bleed the Russians. That's not going to work. We need to have a priority which has to follow from a strategy. Very difficult to do, of course, especially in the US with the elections going forward. But if it's a priority of the West that Ukraine wins this war, then that's what we need, a long-term approach to re-equip and refit Ukrainian armed forces, not just for this phase, to defend themselves and hopefully eventually retake some land, but to deter and defend into the future and bring Ukraine properly into NATO. Like I say, just to repeat myself, I'll stop in 10 seconds. The F-16 program it shows the way. But in terms of land, we're not seeing it. 30 tanks, 30 Abrams tanks, 100 and something Leopards, 14 Challengers, a few hundred artillery systems, keeps them going, but does not deter for the future.
And on that point, Frank, why haven't the Americans fully resupplied the Ukrainian army, for example? I mean, surely it would be in their interest, particularly for President Biden, who needs a political win and will be conscious of the threat of a change of administration in the White House in possibly as little as 12 months' time. Surely it would be in the Americans' interest to do that.
Yeah, you would think so, but you would also think that of the, let's go through the list. I think heavy artillery started, then tanks. There was a great fuss about that. F-16s, of course, months. Well, we all knew these were going to go. ATACMS being the key one, HIMARS as well, and we'll see with other platforms. Perhaps F-18s going forward, that kind of thing. Look, there's all kinds of excuses you can come up with. We're afraid of escalation, or the Ukrainians don't need them, or we assess that this isn't the time, or whatever. For Biden, this is, to me, it's a free win. To none of the gear that I spoke about. I'm thinking specifically of, let's say, the 500 US Marine late model Abrams that went into storage, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. Transfer them straight to, or give an order that the plans should be executed and implemented for those to go to Ukraine. Take 2 years to get them probably fixed up and ready, but that's fine. Give the order now. A long-term program. Is it cost-free? No. But is it expensive? No. Will those tanks ever fight China? No, they won't. You could apply the same across ground capabilities, all of which the US have in storage, none of which will be used in the event of a war in the West Pacific, which of course is a looming threat, which really the US armed forces are more concerned about than anything the Russians can offer. It is avowedly their priority. So look, it's a win. And by the way, it's very difficult to get out of that kind of commitment if you make it. We commit to the transfer of X number of this, X number of that, X number of the other, which will cost so much over a period of 5 to 6 years, air, sea and land assets and training packages with them. Start planning now, and then we won't be worrying this time next year when Russia may or may not have made advances that we can't control.
And just finally, Frank, as we enter 2024, what will you be looking at most closely? What will be the signs that this war is moving significantly in one direction or another that you'll be looking out for?
I would be looking at, and will be looking at, and I'm looking at the incremental gains that the Russians are making in the east towards Kupiansk and towards that Kharkiv direction. I would be looking in the more immediate future, and I know you've discussed this quite recently, at the attrition that is being imposed on Ukrainian air defences for the next 2 or 3 months. It's all very well the Ukrainians saying they're shooting down between 70 and 90% of enemy missiles. They are. But in doing so, they're using up a great deal of ammunition. Let's hope. I think they'll be able to wear that out, but I think it'll be a close run thing. So on land, the incremental gains of Russia and what that means for Ukrainian defensive strategy. I think they're beginning to deal with that. In the air, missile defences for this year that they hold and strengthen, which I think they will as we continue those supplies. That's something I think we the Europeans especially, can help with, US too. But then again, manpower. I think we're unaware of Ukrainian casualties. They're much greater than we are told, that's for sure. And there is a question as to how resilient Ukrainian society will be with respect to things like conscription and compulsory mobilizations. And you can see the fatigue creeping in there in some elements of Ukrainian society with respect to that and the political knock-on effects of it. Those are the things I'll be looking at.
Frank, really appreciate your insight and analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you, James. It's a pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.